Hello, and welcome to My Love Letter Time Machine, a podcast where we are discovering the Victorian love story told through the letters of two ordinary people from Sheffield, Yorkshire, Fred Shepherd and Janie Warburton, who were courting in the 1880s. I'm Ingrid Birchell Hughes, and I just happen to be their great-great-granddaughter. In this first episode, I'm going to introduce you to Fred and Janie, and then we'll see how their story started, rather disconcertingly with a slap. So welcome to My Love Letter Time Machine, where we are travelling through time and space with 200 love letters. I say 200. I haven't actually counted them. I think there might be double, actually. Most afternoons will find me amidst a pile of crumbling old letters, adorned with copper plate writing bearing dates from 1878 to 1882. This might sound unlikely, but I feel like I have my own time machine. The letters are fragile, fiddly to read, and contain the heartbreaking, heartwarming, and sometimes salacious details of my great-great-grandparents' love affair before they got married. Over the episodes, I hope to tell their story, as we watch Fred, who is very much an underdog with his station in life and who, as a match, Janie's family were entirely against. Although he was a lad from the Attercliffe slums, he was eventually headhunted by the North East Midlands Steel Company as the chief accountant of what was destined to become the world's largest producer of steel. Conversely, we'll also see how tragedy brought down the reputation of Janie's family and how they became grateful that Fred had proved himself to be such a dependable person. Fred was born in 1859 and was 19 when he met Janie. He lived in Darnall, Sheffield, and at the beginning of their courtship worked as a trade clerk for Brown, Bailey and Dixon, at the time one of the largest steel mills in the city. Janie was a publican's daughter and lived in the Cross Keys, Handsworth, Sheffield, one of only two public houses sited on consecrated ground in the UK. She was born in 1860 and was 18 when she met Fred. The letters have survived for over 140 years, and during that time have been passed down from mother to daughter 4 times, which is how they came to me. This is not a work of fiction, and yet on many occasions I have found myself rushing through my day until I can get back to reading what has happened to them. Fred pontificates a lot about his views of the world, as well as seeking repeated reassurance from Janie about her feelings for him. He walks this line of boy-man reaching above his station while trying to cover up a desperate insecurity. At the same time, you get the sense that he has a mind like a trap and a wicked sense of humour. Jane, on the other hand, doesn't seem particularly introspective about herself, but she's full of the news about her life, her village, her family. Well, my family, actually. There is nothing more frustrating to me at the moment to be absorbed in their back and forth exchange, to discover a torn-off page or a missing letter altogether. On other occasions, when they back reference a previous conversation, I'll suddenly discover the answer to a particular mystery and I get really excited. Although these events happened so long ago, as I read each letter, it's as if they're happening right now. It's like a parallel timeline that I get to explore. I open a letter, and after a waft of scent of old paper and carbolic soap, I'm suddenly in my great-great-grandmother's bedroom, above the pub in Handsworth, Sheffield. Or I am sat next to Fred at his clerk's desk at the steel mill, as he hides the letter under his ledger so he can write in secret. And he wasn't above using the office letter-headed stationery to do so either. At other times, I am in the parlour of the Wellington pub at Darnall, where Jane is visiting her Aunt Staniforth, the formidable proprietor and the matriarch of the family. For 2 glorious weeks, my great-great-grandfather Fred took me to Bridlington for a summer holiday, where he got to promenade and stretch his comedic writing muscles to entertain his lady love, and the letters take on a flavour of Jerome K. Jerome. I've banned food and drink anywhere near the letters to ensure their preservation, which is just as well, as there have been occasions where their turns of phrase have had me in so much laughter that it could well have been a coffee spraying moment. At other times, I've been suddenly knocked sideways, with moments of such sadness I've found myself tearing up, like the time Janie came home to discover her older sister Emma passed out in the middle of the parlour after sinking a porter bottle of brandy, The house was in uproar, and their father, she described, was crying like a child. Much of the drama in Jane's life was caused by her older sister Emma, who had been abandoned by an abusive husband and had taken to drink by way of some kind of self-medication. Emma's story is painful and has some extraordinary twists, some of which ended up in the newspapers of the day. Discovering this first big family skeleton continues to be a fascinating journey, and in later episodes I will go into more detail. I find myself feeling desperately sorry for Emma, and at the same time I can see why Jane is so keen to get away from her. Emma was deeply sinned against, but seems to have been so damaged that she was unable to stop herself from damaging everybody else. I grew up with the stories that great-aunt Emma was a drunk, and the ridiculous excuse given for this was that she could see the gravestones in the garden outside her bedroom window, given that the pub was built next to the church. Now, after reading the letters and reading the newspaper accounts, I realise what a catastrophe it was for her and for the whole family. Sometimes Jane writes about the rows between Emma and their mother, and I can almost hear the exchange. Other times it's just about little details like popping down to Sheffield to put a down payment on a dinner service, or her father buying a couple of bantams to raffle off to the punters. One of my favourite moments that Fred wrote about was the time how he and his fellow lodgers would troll their housekeeper's lack of pastry ability and make pyramids out of the leftover sturdy pie crust on a single plate, and then abandon the edifice in the middle of the table for her to find later. There are times that being taken along for my time-travelling ride gets a little embarrassing, and that's when Fred and Jane get to pillow talk. After their engagement, Fred stops addressing his letters to my darling Janie and instead writes my darling wifey. Jane in turn writes to Fred, usually as my own dear husband, and they sign themselves retrospectively as each other's true, faithful and loving husband or wife. It's clear that they are underlining again and again that they have made a sincere promise of marriage to each other, although they didn't in fact get married until the October of 1882. They often talk about the possibility of their wedding being moved forward if a baby should happen to be on the way. This gets into some rather euphemistic inquiries regarding Jane's periods and if it has come off yet, and the slightly startling revelation that Fred marks down Jane's periods in his own diary, which is certainly not how we generally think about the Victorians. Janie and Fred are cute and sweet and funny and so very, very young. They're in their first years of their 20s, pouring into each other and the vision of the home they will make, all their hopes and dreams of escape from Sheffield, from the noise, from the dirt, and from the stress and misunderstandings of family. I so often forget that these are my great-great-grandparents. There's no venerability here. It's all young love and moonlit walks. Fred writes in the most beautiful copper plate. He has access to good paper and ink from his work at Brown, Bailey and Dixon, where he was working for 25 shillings a week. While coming from a poor area, Fred had taken full advantage of the new adult education movement, to the point where he was able to escape becoming steel mill fodder and landed this desk job. His letters are in relatively good condition, and I find them fairly easy to read. The folding of the paper and the choice of side to write threw me a bit, and then I started to understand how it was done. First, you fold the paper like a book and write on the front. If you have more to say, write on the back. If you have even more, open the book up and write in the middle. Continue with extra sheets in the same way and then tuck them inside the book. Janie's handwriting is much harder to read, although I think it's better than mine. And she doesn't use full stops, ever. So consequently, it takes a lot longer to understand what she's saying. Clearly, she's not had the education that Fred has, and she feels it. The paper is also flimsy and falling to bits. The ink has faded badly. Given that the letters have been kept in the same place together for 140 years, it's probably testament to the fact that Janie didn't have very much money of her own, so quality paper and ink seem to have been out of the question. I noticed that halfway through the stack of correspondence, Janie's letters are on nicer paper and in much better condition, and I'm willing to bet that Fred has bought her some as a gift at some point. Over the course of this podcast, what I hope to do is to take you through their story as we look at Fred's diary, and then as the letters start to increase in frequency, and at the same time look at what is happening around them in Sheffield and later on Middlesbrough to give context to what's going on. The pair of them are very myopic in their conversations with each other, and they have lots of interesting hints about what is going on around them. So let's have a look at Fred's diary, which he kept for about 2 years. And it looks like he started it on his 19th birthday, May the 16th, 1878. What's wonderful at the start of this story is that Fred records how he and Janie met. So it makes sense that we should start their story here. On the 1st of August, Fred and his chum, also called Fred Johnson, decide to go for a walk in Bowden Houstead Woods, which is approximately halfway between Handsworth and Dartnall, southeast of the centre of Sheffield. Fred writes, "We met Janie Reckless of the Wellington Darnall and were introduced to her companion, Miss Janie Warburton of the Cross Keys, Handsworth, her cousin, with whom I paired off." Now, I know 2 Freds and 2 Janies is a bit confusing, and I have a funny feeling that this was probably a most wonderful icebreaker. Fred sees her again the next day. Information must have gone around the local grapevine because Fred's other friend, Ted, we have a Fred and Ted triumvirate here, is seeing a lady called Miss Bray, and helpfully have arranged things so they can become a pair of courting couples. Strange to say, writes Fred, Miss Bray made a friend of Miss Warburton, so that Ted and I were companions in love and took every opportunity of seeing them. All goes well, until in September things start to come a bit unstuck. Fred writes, "Old Ted was thrown over by Miss Bray for some unaccountable reason. I stuck to it until one night Mrs. Warburton came out and kicked up around about her daughter walking out with one fellow and writing to another, to whom she was engaged. An explanation followed, and Mr. Brick, the man's name, was given up. But I was told he would have been given up anyway if I'd not been in it at all." This seems to be entirely new information to our Fred. September the 10th, Fred and Ted head up to Handsworth to try and sort their love lives out, but then things take an upsetting turn for Fred. He writes, "Ted walked off with Miss Bray, but Janie not being there, I waited until she came out. It seems that Tuesday is washing day at their house, and as they were rather late, she could not get out at that time. Her mother, it seems, did not wish her to come out at all, but she would persist in coming out to see me, although I could see that she had been crying. About 9:30 we returned, and I had taken leave of her, when just as she got to the door, who would come out but Mrs. Warburton, who, I think, struck her. But as I could not interfere between mother and daughter, I walked on. It seems that Janie hurried after us, but did not overtake us." When I first read this, I suddenly felt quite shocked, witnessing that Janie and her mother, Maria, had come to blows. It's hard to say if Mrs. Warburton was primarily concerned about her daughter's reputation, or if Mr. Bricks was considered a far more attractive prospect than Fred. Clearly Janie didn't think so. I'm also experiencing a strange split here. Part of me is fascinated by an event that seems so visceral, and another part of me is thinking, hang on a minute, this is my family, which feels weird. The drama of Jane being hit by her mother for being seen with the wrong man clearly upset Fred. After I finished reading and transcribing his whole diary, I now realise he's not given to writing his feelings down in it very much at all. It's rare when he does, and on one occasion the economy of expression had me weeping. I'll share that in more detail in the next episode. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that these two are really still quite young. In the autumn of 1878, Fred was 19 and Jane was 18. While Fred doesn't seem to express things, he's not backwards in resolving confrontation, perhaps even showing a little lack of judgment. Or he may be a believer in the idea of faint heart never did win, fair lady. Anyway, for whatever reason, he tries to see Jane at the Cross Keys and unsurprisingly gets short shrift from the mother. Wednesday, September the 11th. The occurrence of last night completely upset me. So having half a day off, Tom Hughes and I set off for Beerley Spa by way of Handsworth and Woodhouse. I called in at the Cross Keys but did not see Janie. Her mother waited off me and I thought was rather cruel. I mean, what was he expecting? Anyway, Fred, clearly indignant, decides to write what appears to be the first letter between them, which I share here in its entirety. September the 11th, 1878. Dear Janie, I was compelled, though most unwillingly, to hear what your mother said on Tuesday week, and as it was through me, I have come to the conclusion that rather than you should suffer a repetition of the annoyance and indignity, I would discontinue my visits to Handsworth, at least for the present. I also heard your mater familia say that she would not have you walking out with me and writing to another at the same time. If this is correct, it must be the same one I heard of before, and of whom I spoke to you, but you did not try to explain it. It appears now that it would have been much better if you had, for although I do not want to preach, I cannot help saying, but I think you could not have expected a good outcome through or by a deception practised on both of us. However, I will forgive you this once. Why your mother should have allowed you to go to Warncliffe and now kick up this bother, I can't understand. It would save misunderstanding if you would answer as to the receipt of this letter, and also say whether you agree with the conclusions I have come to. If you do not, I shall be glad to place myself at your disposal and at your earliest convenience. Do not think I am treating you lightly, far from it, but it is better to look at it in a matter-of-fact sort of way, rather than in a romantic. You may think that I ought to have more perseverance as to coming up now that the weather is cloudy, but if I did, it would only cause you bother and trouble, so that it is well I have not. If you do write, I hope you will, you can either direct it to 34 Freedom Hill, Darnell, or to Messrs. Brown, Bailey and Dixon Limited, Attercliffe. If you do not write, the probability is that I should never know whether you have received it or not, as I do not know whether they open your letters or not at home. But believe me, I shall ever remain your sincere friend, admirer and well-wisher, Fred. P.S. I have to thank you for the many happy hours I have spent in your company. So this is Fred trying to find out why Janie has essentially been two-timing him. He clearly likes her a lot to go to this effort and to find some clarity. We don't have Janie's reply, but she did send one, as Fred records it in his diary. Friday, September the 13th. Ted brought me a letter from Janie. In it she says that when her mother is vexed, she does not think what she says. That it is quite correct she was engaged, but intended breaking it off in July, but had been prevented. However, it is now broken off. As I had had many pleasant hours with her, she hoped I should have many more, and also that the expedition to Woodhouse Church, which has been proposed, should not fall through. I've been wondering about the circumstances of this Mr. Bricks, that the Warburtons seem so keen on Jane marrying, to the point of preventing Jane breaking with him. He obviously had some appeal, maybe of a financial kind, but not of much else as far as Jane was concerned. It is clear that there is enormous attraction between Jane and Fred, for them to be exercising their own wills so strongly in the face of objection. And I'm having fun trying to work out exactly what it is. From the in-jokes they share in their later letters, humour seems to be very present. I found myself giggling at their turns of phrase, which seem so comfortably familiar. In the truest sense of the word, the dry, deadpan Yorkshire wit is so familial. And of course it is. My mum grew up in her grandmother's home, who was Edith, Fred and Jane's daughter. This is our family humour. And I assume that it's as old as the hills. Anyway, the letter smooths the way, and 2 days later it is all back on. Sunday, September the 15th, 1878. It rained very hard at 5:30, so did not go to Handsworth until after our church at 8. Saw Janie, had a walk with her, who was on very delicate ground, but eventually cleared of all doubts and enjoyed myself immensely. Thanks for listening to my love letter time machine. We'll be back in our next episode, in which Fred has some bad news at home, and we learn about what happened when the world's first floodlit football match was held in Sheffield. In the meantime, you can follow me sharing excerpts of Fred and Janie's letters on Instagram at my love letter time machine, all one word, or on my blog at mydarlingjanie.co.uk. Have a great week.